Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Collective Liberation, Disrupt, Dismantle, Manifest. My name is Anissa Antar, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this session. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I have brown curly hair, and I am wearing a purple and yellow shirt. I'm sitting in front of a blue wall. There's a poster above my shoulder that says essential work. And by inclusively introducing myself, I acknowledge the diversity of our community and strive to create a better sense of belonging. I welcome you today from my home. I am currently in unceded occupied Dakota land, Bide Ota Otunwe, or so-called Minneapolis. And I extend my gratitude to the indigenous peoples of this region, the Anishinaabe, the Ho-Chunk, the Dakota, for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and play on their traditional homelands. We usually collaborate with local indigenous communities to help develop a land acknowledgement specific to our conference location. And this year, we're inviting folks from many different places. So instead, we ask that you please take a moment to reflect on the history, social circumstances, and personal experiences that bring us to this moment. Thank you very much. Today we are joined by Rose Paquet and Nikhil Trivedi. I also wanted to make a note that we have two ASL interpreters, Sarah and Jasmine, and they will be spotlit so you can adjust your screen if you need to see them more clearly for their interpretation. Yeah, we're on day 3 of the conference. I can't believe it. This feels like the longest 4-day weekend or 4-day week I think we've had in a while, but it's been an incredible 3 days of learning, collaborating, dissecting, dismantling, asking questions, getting curious, and it's been a pleasure to be in space with many of you. So you can see the schedule here. Right now we are at why cultural institutions should advocate for the defunding of local police departments. And we have 2 more sessions today. I hope you will join us at 4 p.m. Eastern time for museum unions organizing, and then later at 6 p.m. for our closing session around manifesting. And on to our presentation for today. This will be more of hopefully a dialogue and conversation. I realize we're in a webinar format, but we really would love to encourage you all to use the chat function for a more dynamic engagement with the speakers. So if you are using the chat, make sure to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the brilliant thoughts that you have to contribute in the session. So unfortunately, Dr. Porchia Moore couldn't attend today. However, I'm so honored and thrilled to turn it over to Nikhil and Rose for them to do a bit of framing, introduce themselves, and we can begin this wonderful and important and timely conversation. I do want to as I'm calling from Minneapolis, obviously this is a center for a lot of conversations around police abolition and the defunding and dismantling of police departments with the murder of George Floyd. And I'm not sure if folks have heard yet, but last night, police did murder Winston Smith in Minneapolis, in South Minneapolis. And so I wonder if we could also just hold a moment for Winston Smith, our most recent departed ancestor, along with Dante Wright, who was also murdered by police in Minnesota, and for George Floyd, and for the numerous of Black folks, trans folks, people with disabilities who are murdered by police daily, and for holding space for them in rage and for absolute justice for the loss of their life. Thank you. These folks did not die in martyrdom, and we need to absolutely be holding police departments across this country, across the globe, accountable and bring justice for the many families and loved ones who are left in the wake of this violence. And so it's a heavy topic. There's a lot to unpack, to process, but this is an opportunity for us to start having these conversations together collectively, conversations that have been ongoing. So enough from me. I mean, we'll be popping in here and there. Jackie Peterson is also joining us. So it's gonna be a dynamic conversation. So Rose and Nikhil, please.
Thanks so much, Anissa, and thanks for bringing in the names of folks who have been directly affected by the problem that we're discussing today. I deeply appreciate that. My name is Nikhil Trivedi. My pronouns are he and him. I'm seated in my dining room in my house. There's an open space behind me with some photos, black and white photos on a wall, and a big colorful painting in the room behind me. And I'm wearing a black t-shirt and I have a salt and pepper beard. And I'm a cinnamon colored brown man. And I'm calling from the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Adawa, and the Potawatomi nations. And I'm the director of engineering at a museum in Chicago, as well as a facilitator, educator, and community builder. In addition to building, planning, and executing complex web projects, I also collaborate and connect with institutions to create plans around the healing and accountability from historic traumas like colonialism, slavery, genocide, and war. I'm the co-creator along with Dr. Porchia Moore with the Visitors of Color Project. And although she's not with us today, her presence is very much felt by me. And I'm also part of the Equity Coalition and on the board of MCN, a museum tech conference community. I'm a regular contributor at the Inclusium, a project advisor for Mass Action, and my writing has been featured in Journal for Museum Education, Forward Museums, and Model View Culture. It feels weird kind of reading my bio and talking so much about myself, but just to give you all some context, I'll pass it on to Rose to introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Nikhil. Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here with all of you. My name is Rose Paquet, and I am seated in my friend's wooden home on unceded Pomo land here in Northern California. I am currently on living in an intentional community and am immersed in nature, for which I'm very grateful for, and give thanks for all of beings that surround us at all times. And I'm wearing a polka dot headscarf, glasses, blue t-shirt, and I am in a white-bodied skin. To say more about myself, I am the co-founder of the Incluseum, a project that has been collectively re-envisioning museums through the lenses of inclusion and equity for the last 9 years. And which is exciting to think that, wow, it's already been 9 years of collective work. And I want to give thanks to everyone who's been a part of this project, because it's through this collective, collaborative work that we've been advancing what we've been doing. I am a current member of the Chatham County Community Remembrance Project Coalition, which is a project taking place in Savannah, Georgia, where I was residing for the last few years before coming out to California a few months ago. And this is a project that is being done in partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And we're working to commemorate documented victims of race terror lynchings in Chatham County, Georgia. And this is really a grassroots community effort that's bringing together a lot of people for this work. And I encourage everybody to look more into the project of Equal Justice Initiative and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. That's enough about me. So let's take it to our next section, Nikhil.
Yeah, like Anissa said, we're hoping this will be a dynamic conversation with you all as participants. While I'm sort of in this webinar thing, I don't consider myself hardly an expert on police abolition, prison abolition, and the defunding the police movements. So I feel like there's probably a lot of folks in this room who would have a lot of really insightful perspectives to share. So I encourage you all to be active participators in this conversation. I want to recognize that Anissa and Jackie are also up here as presenters too. And just wanted to give you all a moment to introduce yourself if you would like to.
Hello, my name's Anissa. As I said, I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I currently work as an activation specialist at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and I am part of the Equity Coalition as one of the co-organizers of Mass Action, Museums as Site for Social Action. And it's so awesome to be here. I'm very excited. And I think being in Minneapolis, yeah, thinking a lot about this topic, don't consider myself an expert by any means, but really hoping to share and generate with everyone here.
Thank you, Anissa. Thank you, Nikhil and Rose. My name is Jackie Peterson. I use she, her pronouns. I am joining you all from unceded Duwamish territory, otherwise known as Seattle, Washington. I am a consultant for museums. I do exhibition development and writing, primarily for history museums and historic sites. And I am also a part of the Equity Coalition as a steering committee member for museums and race. And I'm also part of the Empathetic Museum. So having lived through last summer in Seattle as one of the places I'm sure many of you heard about in the media, the issue of defunding the police is very close to me. And so I'm very excited and I'm humbled, quite frankly, to be a part of this conversation and hear what you all are interested in talking about, what's concerning you, and what kind of ideas people have for how we all move forward together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jackie and Anissa. So we wanted to start our time together today by not making any sort of assumptions about where you all as attendees might be coming from in this conversation. There might be folks who are all in on the abolition movement, prisons and police, tear it all down. There might be folks who are kind of on the fence and a little unsure and have a lot of questions, honestly, about what it might mean, to abolish these systems. So we wanted to carve out a little space just to frame the fundamental arguments for abolishing the police and defunding the police. For those of us who might be kind of on the fence and have a lot of questions, I want to create space for us to raise those questions and respond to them. And for those of us who are all in on the abolition movement, I feel like it's a good practice for us to hone our ability to frame and lay out the arguments. When we're bringing this conversation in the context of our organizations as museums, we're going to be having these conversations with people who are coming from all sorts of different directions. So I, for myself personally, can use more practice in really laying it all out and being clear and concise about the fundamental arguments for doing so. So I want to start this conversation by inviting you all as participants in the chat, other folks who are up here as panelists, to respond to the question, what are the fundamental arguments for defunding the police, for abolishing the police? So please, again, remember to set your chat settings to panelists and attendees. Go ahead and chime in the chat. And I'll invite folks who are up here as attendees to share some of what you might be thinking in response to that question.
I'll chime in to kick us off if that's okay. I think that from what I have seen, that particularly living here in Seattle and living in a predominantly Black and Brown and immigrant community, and seeing just how much divestment has happened and how much just the way that resources are being distributed in and around the city. I think for me, the argument becomes clear when you see how much wealth disparity and how much inequity there is, and how much of that money is going to or being unequitably distributed to our police department, where it can be redirected to communities who are very desperately in need, communities who need resources to keep people out of poverty, who need resources for more equitable education, people who need resources for housing, quite frankly. And so, at the moment, our police budget is very top of mind. Our city council is in the process of approving it as we speak. And it's, I'm seeing it for myself. I know a lot of other people in my community are seeing it too. And I think fundamentally for me is just, it's about reinvesting funds in the communities that need it. And I don't really think that policing needs to be a priority for that funding anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really insightful, Jackie. And I think too, kind of in a larger sense of what you're describing, the police are simply not trained and were not intended to do many of the jobs that they perform. And defunding the police allows experts with those areas of skills, those sets of skills, to step in when needed. Police spend a vast majority of their time dealing with non-violent, non-criminal issues, yet that's what they're trained and suited and expected to respond to most of the time. And what we're seeing is a result of that exact expectation. So totally echo and hear that. lifting up some things folks have said in the chat. Daria Neely mentioned that police don't actually make communities safer, and the resources invested in police would be better spent elsewhere. Anita Bateman echoed similarly, police are meant to surveil communities rather than support them. And as such, they'll always prioritize safeguarding white supremacy. You know, a second sort of beyond like police simply not being trained, and were not intended to do many of the jobs they were perform. A second fundamental argument to me, and that I'm hearing folks echo in the chat, is that police simply don't provide safety. There's this assumption that like we have this system, this institution that provides safety, and they simply don't. Police departments are historically oppressive and violent institutions, and defunding them will reduce violence against people of color and overall crime. And the only way to diminish police violence in particular is to reduce contact between the public and police. Seeing a lot of really great stuff in the chat. Other panelists, feel free to lift up things that resonate with you all too.
I love this question from Chelsea. I know she made it a point maybe to talk about later, but I think it is relevant, particularly because it is specifically about the relationship between local police and museums. And she says that because of Colorado's history of mass shootings, her museum's relationship with their local police department has become a lot deeper. And understanding that police aren't necessarily equipped to deal with mass shootings and active shooters, but you know, that fear of mass shooting, which I'm sure a lot of us have also experienced, that fear is still there. And how do we think about alternatives to either engaging police with active shooter situations or dealing with that level of that real fear of, you know, constantly living under the threat of a mass shooting, and how do we in the cultural sector particularly think about that?
Yeah, we'll definitely create more space to dig into at a museum institutional level, ways that we might replicate policing, ways that we might be connecting more deeply with policing in this moment.
I want to lift up what Latanya put in the chat about just kind of thinking about, I think, and making a connection to museums as well, but the modern police institution as we know it literally is derived out of patrolling enslaved peoples in the South, and in the North, enacting violence against union organizers, slavery abolitionists. So I really appreciate what Latanya is saying about how police are literally providing safety for the rich white folks, and other folks are noting here that police are really equipped only to deal with protecting private property, and that they will choose property over people. And we see this time and time again. I think this is really connected and rooted in obviously other forms of colonial violence, racialized violence, but there's a really strong connection to museums as well. Thinking about if the roots are poison, right, whatever comes out of those roots is also going to be poison. My colleague Elizabeth and I talk about this a lot. So I think just being able to understand the history is also super important. Thinking about genealogy, understanding the colonial and racist genesis of police is really, really essential, because that is why police respond to, I think, like 3% of violent crimes. And it's not even preventing, it's really reactive, right? I've never personally experienced a police officer preventing anything, right? It's always after the fact. And so, yeah, thinking about the brilliant work of lots of different kinds of police and police abolitionists and transformative justice workers who are thinking about what are the other modes of being that are actually life affirming. Somebody said life affirming. What are we putting into, yeah, how are we resourcing different community projects, community-based, literally block by block based projects that are helping keep folks safe and accountable and able to kind of touch at things like de-escalation training or mental health, or just providing resources and options, especially for young folks, so that there's something to do and to work towards instead of just being at the service of kind of capitalist, racialized capitalism.
Mhm.
Wow, the chat's going wild and we love to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, Nisa, if we take a step back and like consider that police and prisons are institutions, and what are institutions but socially agreed upon solutions to a problem, right? And like you said, like Latanya said, the system of policing and prisons were founded on the problem of enslaved people, right? So the system is always responding to Black folks, to disabled folks, to people of color, Indigenous people as the problem. And in our context today, if we consider that police are institutions and institutions are socially agreed upon solutions to a problem, what is the problem that police solve today? And if there is no problem that we can clearly articulate that the police and the prison system solves, why do they exist at all? I want to lift up the work of Critical Resistance. They're a longtime prison and police abolition organization, and their vision is to create a genuinely healthy and stable communities that respond to harm without relying on imprisonment and punishment. The system rather works precisely as it is designed to control, contain, and kill those people representing the greatest threats to state power. Their goal is not to improve the system even further, but to shrink it into non-existence. And like improving the system is something we hear a lot from folks who, yeah, thanks for sharing that link. And the vision that I'm sort of echoing is from their annual report, which I shared in the chat as well. And another fundamental argument for defunding, abolishing the police, in response to folks who might sort of be wondering about reforming the system, it's important for us to remember that reform of the police system has been high on the radar of these conversations for 30 years, right? After the brutal attack of Rodney King by police in 1991, we've been talking about reform for 30 years. And in the case of George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, going to slow down for that to be spelled. I just realized I'm talking kind of fast with the ASL interpreter. In the case of Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd, he had 17 misconduct complaints over nearly 2 decades of working in police and was never actually removed from the police force. And this is in the context of a city that has been reforming their police department for many decades. So reform is simply not working, and we can't keep having conversation about further reforms. Here in Chicago, our mayor's talking in response to the murder of Adam Toledo about instituting policies to prevent police chases. Yet those policies provide caveats when there's an immediate threat or some language like that. And in fact, like that policy being in place wouldn't have actually prevented those folks from getting killed because of the fact that these bodies are seen as a threat just by merely existing in the system that we're trying to reform. So appreciate so many fire comments in the chat. appreciating holding space for all of the rage. Want to move on to the next section of our conversation. I'll pass it on to Rose to carry us through.
Thanks, Nikhil. And thank you everybody for participating in the chat. One thing that really struck me when looking into the funding of police violence is how it has increased so much over time that it's the snowball effect of more and more and more and more money to become this conglomerate that just is not doing service really to the things that need to be addressed in our communities, and that could be obviously better addressed through other means, other approaches. So let's see, turning to our linking now this discussion of the problem, why defund the police, this question to museums themselves, as Anissa was saying and reflecting on her conversations with Elizabeth, is this roots, these shared roots as institutions that are linked to genocide, colonialism, enslavement, and all these different systems of oppressions, and how do we then look into museums as not separate space from this conversation of defunding the police, but also as a linked space where these issues are also occurring within and linked without, out of the institution, but with the police system itself. So so I'm going to start here with an open question to keep the conversation going. Is how do you think that museums replicate systems of policing? And I saw in the chat here, and several of you have already made this connection within your responses to the previous questions that Nikhil had asked, but one that I'm caught my eye here is from Karen Robertson, who they said, police physically present in museums are keeping marginalized folks even further out of the spaces where we can discuss our shared histories and values. History so often gives power to racism in our country. What does it mean if police presence keeps anyone but white folks out of the History Museum? White protection of a certain historical narrative, which echoes also what LaTanya was saying above about police existing for the protection of white folks, rich white folks, white property. So same thing here we see with this comment about museums, that policing in museums linked to policing, maintains intact this narrative, white history and white supremacy in our country. Thank you, Karen, for this comment. I'm going to keep scrolling down here. There's been so many more since that comment. Right. Right. So here we see Andrea says that, points that, for example, at the DIA museum, for example, collaborates with local police. And this is not uncommon that for museums to have collaborations with the local police in their community, in their town or city, wherever they are. So direct connection, not just kind of a conceptual connection, but a really direct, tangible connection of money being transferred from one to the other. So direct support. Yeah.
And those collaborations can look a few different ways, right? Our museums could offer free admission to people in police, and that's one way that money is traded for the service service. That's a weird way to frame it. Money exchange for policing. And also some Latanya mentioned in the chat that museums often contract with security companies composed of police. Beyond our security companies, sometimes our museums will bring in local law enforcement to train our security teams. So the collaboration between museums and local law enforcement can look a few different ways. And I'm curious what other ways folks might see that collaboration happening at your institutions.
I know at our museum at MIA, we, after the murder of George Floyd, one of the kind of actions that happened across the city was just cutting ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. So MIA used to contract off-duty police officers to just kind of hang out in parking lots and be kind of on call if needed. And they have since severed that relationship. And I know that also happened at the Walker Art Institute in Minneapolis, and it happened in lots of other across the country. However, this was done in a way without an alternative. So again, the kind of premise is, oh, these folks are keeping people safe, or at least being responsive to frontline workers or visitor experience workers. And yet there was a divestment without kind of putting something else in its place. So now something that, I mean, I don't want to go into like a solution, but because I know we're talking about the ways that police or museums replicate police work, but I do think it's important to name, you know, it's one thing to, yeah, get rid of or, you know, get rid of a contract with police if you do have one, but what are the other steps being put in place to talk about safety for visitors and for staff? Are your staff getting de-escalation trainings? You know, is there kind of a more robust plan with security around, or your guards or security to think through, you know, non-punitive ways of asking visitors or other museum goers, you know, if there is a safety that's being called into question. I mean, we can't be just creating a void. And I think that's one thing that people who talk about abolition really want to stress, is that it's not about just completely dismantling. It's also, you know, putting in a more life-affirming alternative. And so I hope that within these conversations, yes, local cultural institutions should divest from police, but you can't just do that in a void and not prioritize or think through these alternative ways of, you know, creating a more community-centered understanding. Set up a, you know, a community neighborhood walkthrough. Is your museum open to folks who come through, to unhoused neighbors who, you know, need a place to hang out for the day, to chill? Are you setting up a garden or, you know, a free fridge for people who need access to food or other resources? I think there are lots of ways we can get creative with these alternatives. It's just about prioritizing it, budgeting it, you know, having someone be a part of, and having the neighborhood, the community be a part of the visioning of what does community safety look like, instead of just saying like, okay, we're severing ties, but we'll call the police if we actually have to, you know, or we're going to hire this outside contractor, security contractor, like Latanya said, who are mostly ex-cops, ex-prison guards, ex-soldiers, right? And it's rarely a priority, as Christine said in the chat, because it doesn't bring in revenue. So how is that, do we have to like tie it to revenue? I personally don't think so, but I think we need to hopefully expand and go beyond. But I'm curious to folks in the chat, on the panel, like what are some other creative ways? sorry, I went like really far down the line. I'm nonlinear. We can go back to these examples of policing showing up, museums replicating policing. And then I know we're going to move to some alternatives and some other structures, but I just wanted to name this, this kind of cycle of like, okay, we'll dismantle, but we're not putting anything else in place. We're not prioritizing this in another way.
And I want to recognize that, like, for a lot of our organizations, most of the Black and Brown staff is in our security departments, right? For whether we have in-house security teams or even if they're contracted. And so what does it mean for us to be rethinking about police, and how are the folks who currently fill those roles getting support to, to move to the revisioning that we might be aiming for within our organizations?
One piece that I wanted to bring back up and to acknowledge that this was something that Dr. Porchia Moore had talked about in our preparatory meeting before this. She had brought up the fact that a lot of artwork and artifacts being put on exhibition have high insurance. So there's an incentive to have this policing of these artifacts, because if there's a damage, then to them, that's part of the puzzle here. So this problem of putting more value in the objects and the artifact and their safety over the safety and well-being of visitors and community members.
I love this point that Karen Robertson brings up about this idea of expertise and museums seeing our visitors as non-experts, and that relationship between museum staff being the experts and the authority on their content, rather than it being a shared expertise and seeing our visitors as people who can help contribute and actually help museums better understand the real value of the objects and the artifacts that they have. So thank you, Karen. I just wanted to lift that up because I think that's really important. I think this power dynamic of museum being authority versus, our visitors being these kind of empty vessels that we are imparting knowledge on, that paradigm is still very much present. And I think a lot of work needs to be done on shifting that power dynamic, because I think if we see our visitors and our community members, quite frankly, as experts as well, and valuing what they see as valuable and important to them, really will help us inform and reshape the way that we connect with them. And it won't be so much of oh, we have to surveil you because we think you're going to touch things or steal things, rather than being more invitational to say, is this something you value? Is this something that you care about? Is this something that's even important to your community?
Absolutely. And I just want to name also another tension of within museums, who gets policed and who gets a pass. And so Andrea's saying, policing is uneven. There are donor events where donors are often, not beholden to the same kinds of rules, but we have to protect their feelings so they don't get offended. And yet visitors of color, there's very infrequently, or we hear often, the ways that visitors of color are not treated with that same care, that same respect. So, what would it take for us to start treating our community, to start treating our visitors of color, especially those who have not, historically been able to even enter museums, let alone feel invited or included? How do we start treating those folks the same way that we treat our donors? And I think part of that is setting up a different culture, a culture of care, an ethics of care. And I think that's a large part of this kind of imbalance of power that shows up in, punitive policing kind of energy in museums, unfortunately. Like, who gets to do what in the space,
Yeah. And Karen lifts up a dynamic too of be nice to them, they pay our salaries, an uncomfortable situation. But I mean, if folks who pay admission to enter our museums are also paying our salaries. If admission is free in our museums, folks who are paying taxes in the cities we live in are also paying our salaries. But that's not how we're framing these conversations.
Oh yes, that's something that I'm really actually curious about, is connecting with other publicly funded museums to just think through a little bit more. What does it mean to be, funded through taxpayer dollars and really be thought of as the People's Museum versus, prioritizing, centering the physical material culture? Yes, that's important, but it's often not even done in ways that feels responsible, authentic, co-creative, meaning making with communities who, to quote Nikhil, how do we hold the stuff we hold in trust? No, I'm saying that wrong. Your mass action chapter, how do we hold the collections we hold in trust? I think I'm saying that right. But just even thinking about the different ways that materiality gets prioritized, the physical, literal building versus the people within it. Thinking about COVID right now too, as things are starting to open up, like how are we prioritizing safety of visitors and staff, especially frontline workers who we know, percentage-wise are Black and Brown staff in those kind of, front-facing visitor experience roles, security, facilities, janitorial. Anyway, I could go on and on. Whew. But yes, it's very important to name the kind of public tax moment, and even for private museums too. This is across the board.
Well, thanks, Anissa. And what you're saying connects directly to where we're going now, which is our more closing moment, but where we're looking to, and what's already been brought about in our conversation so far is next steps or action steps that can be taken from this conversations we've been having, and pulling apart the problem a little bit more. And Anissa, you were talking about some kind of solution-oriented things earlier in our discussion. So, and taking into account that the defunding the police is linked to all other, it's not a single issue problem, and is connected to many other things in our communities, such as ending homelessness and hunger, ending poverty, ensuring equitable access to education, and more. So making space now for anybody who wants to share in the chat, or here in the other panelists who want to share verbally what you think as next steps or action steps.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that museums are institutions, museums and cultural institutions are part of a network of oppressive institutions, right? So, we can think about how to undo the dynamics of policing within our organizations, how to replace them anew, and we need to be thinking about that. But we are also in a wider world where we're connected, we're influenced by, we depend on all these other institutions as well. And there's only so much that we can really do alone in isolation from that network of oppressive institutions. So what really will it take for museums to end our practice of policing, for museums to participate in the movement to abolish police and prisons? Like Rose said, it requires us to align with demands to, end homelessness in our communities. That's closely connected with some of the reasons why our institutions feel like we need to have policing in the first place. Ending hunger in our communities, ending poverty, making sure everyone has equal access to healthcare, to education. Like, we need to be organizations that are connecting with the struggles in our communities that are making these demands and supporting them in moving them forward so that we can have more space within our organization to frame things anew, to create new ways to respond to problems that are beyond just us, just our organizations, that are endemic to our entire societies. If our country could defund the military and all police, what would we do with those billions of extra dollars that we would have at the local level and at the national level every year? We could end homelessness and all these things, and we could fund cultural institutions so we don't have to be in this rat race of like fighting for the same money every year. There's so much that's possible. And this isn't something that we can wait to happen at a national level. Like, defunding the police, abolishing the police is something that will begin at a hyper local level. So us as cultural institutions within the geographies that we exist can have a really important role to play in these conversations at the very local level and creating change at that level that can then spread out from there.
Okay, so in the chat, we have a couple of thoughts. So collaborate with activists in our communities who are leading this work, creating relationships with restorative justice organizations in your community. They have been there and historically doing the work. Thinking about doing structural changes, bringing these issues and conversation into the content that we deliver through programs and exhibitions. It's our responsibility to start telling truthful narratives. Adjusting budgets so community work is foregrounded, not just some little program on the side. Yeah, embedding that into the fabric, yes. Creating community healing and mediation spaces, excuse me. As an educational institution, can we be a platform of defining the defund the police movement, or tell the story of oppressive history of police? A second for rebudgeting. Budgets are moral documents. Love that. Oh, and act with urgency. Yeah. I'm trying to think about your question, Nikhil, about what we would do with just the billions of dollars. And as someone who's kind of like, budgets, I feel like, yeah, I would love to see free schooling for every young person, just out the gate. Everybody gets free school before you're entering the K-12 system and afterwards as well. And within that, not just schooling, but arts, programming, science, technology, just like stimulating, engaging activities. More radio, more community radio. Shout out to the community radio people in the audience if there are any. Like that was a huge part of my kind of like, eye-opening to media justice work in general. That's what came to mind right away. I'm just thinking about the young folks, like 7 generations learning. What are we planting the seeds now in order to help carry through the next generation of folks? And then how is that also honoring our ancestors before us who have been putting in the work to get us to the point that we have, that we are now? That's what comes to mind. Anything else? I don't know. and folks are saying stuff in the chat too.
Someone's giving a shout out to KFAI in Minneapolis.
Oh my gosh, KFAI, yes. And KRSM, shout out KRSM.
But to follow up on your question, Lisa, like my vision is for everyone in the world, not just the geography of these lines we built around our country, but everyone in the world to have everything that they need to live a full and fulfilling life. And at like the lowest bar to that is housing and food and education. And there's so much more we can do above and beyond that.
Healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the most basic fundamental human rights should just be taken care of. And it just feels so obvious. And you're like, why is this privatized or corporatized? You know, like we have this, I have just like, and that maybe sounds a little kumbaya, like, oh my gosh, but it just blows my mind the ways in which capitalism just seeps into basic life affirming everything. So shout out, yeah, and 100% get rid of the borders, you know, give sovereignty back to Indigenous peoples. Let's just, it's gotta go. Everything must go.
I would like to lift up what Heidi said, which is something that has been really crucial to me, is the concept of dignity and self-determination, that everybody deserves to be treated with dignity, and everybody has and deserves the right to self-determine. So I think all of that redistribution of wealth, that redistribution of state funding should be in support of allowing every human being to live with dignity.
Coming back to the question that Rose proposed of actions that our organizations could take, we're talking about like operating at a really hyper local level of the geographies that our organizations are situated within, and ways that we can support local movements to defund or abolish the police. When we were in the before times, often it was hard to find a central meeting place, you know, for local grassroots community organizations. We have space, right? Like that's something simple and easy for us to provide, simply a meeting space for organizations doing work that we want to support.
Yes, thanks for that comment, Nikhil. It always surprising how it gets discombobulated. Oh, but there's assets right there. The building, the space, asset, boom, right away. Bathrooms. Okay, there we go. We can make that available to people. Meeting space. We can make that available. We have a water fountain. Make that available to people. That's a first step. Generosity and welcome.
Yeah, museums ought to be sites of mutual aid, and that's not just, we're not thinking just in terms of like financial resource redistribution, which like absolutely should be happening in terms of budget prioritization, but yeah, the way that the physical building is, you know, so often the site of what needs to be protected. It's like, no, we need to be opening that up. That's, yeah, how are we building capacity with what we have? Engaging in mutual aid, providing space for yeah, truly anyone to come in. We're kind of one of the last like free and open public spaces. I mean, for those who are, you know, public institutions, at least at MIA, it's one of the last free spaces in the city besides libraries. And libraries are, you know, running miles around museums in terms of, they have a lot of work to do too, don't get me wrong. But I do think there's a lot that museums can draw from the services that our library friends are providing. And speaking of mutual aid, And just this comment, Christine, thank you. Like, are we going to change the world? Absolutely, we're doing it right now. We're transforming. I want to drop a link to the chat. Probably those who participated in other sessions know about the Ask and Offers document. We're just, you know, wanting to connect and keep these conversations going after these sessions, after these 3 days. So if you have kind of things that you want to organize around, to get curious about things that you can offer or that you're asking for, let's use the expertise, the brilliance within the rooms and the community that we're creating, albeit virtually. But, you know, this is the time for us to get connected, to get situated, to get organized, so that we can, you know, make this high dream of museum transformation and really world and systems transformation happen. So take a look at the Asks and Offers doc in the chat for those who are interested in, yeah, being in touch, stay in touch.
And the offer side is pretty empty in the spreadsheet. So just want to say offers can be big and small. Offers could be like, I'll read a book with you sometime in the next year, right? Like the opportunity here is to just continue and create connections coming out of this space. So if the offer side feels like a little much, think of small ways, small things that you might be able to offer other folks in this community.
Thanks for that reminder, Nikhil. Yes, the offer can be like, I'm offering some time to sit and chat. Rose, did you have another thought? Or Jackie or Nikhil?
I want to reiterate this a couple points from our conversation about connecting locally, hyper-local efforts, connecting with others, doing this work, and maybe direct and also more, I don't want to say indirect ways, but institutions or organizations like museums who are interested in being part of these efforts, connect with them too, because it's working together across, I think, across organizations, across spaces, and in a cross-pollination way that likely come up with great ideas for action steps too. And thinking about assets again, Heidi up above said something about having 75 acres of old growth forest. Wow, what an asset, thinking about, putting that space to use for gathering. And nature can have such a soothing impact on folks too. So bring that in, bring those beings in, those kin folks into the conversation to hold space with us and to re-envision a world where also we're protecting that part of our greater community too, which is not disconnected, but a bit tangential. Thank you everybody for your participation. Does anybody else on the panel have another question in closing to ask to participants?
If in our last few minutes, if participants have any questions you'd like to offer to the entire list of participants, us panelists included, please feel free. Seeing lots of appreciation in the chat. Thank you all so much for showing up and participating. I see a question by Andrea. Have you seen any museums apply anti-racist trainings for security teams? in my museum, we've had, over the course of a year, we had a series of, they were effectively 2-day anti-oppression trainings that were open to all staff. And our director made it clear that like all managers should support staff that they have who are interested in attending and create space for folks who attend. So we did have folks on our security teams attend those conversations, and it made for a much richer experience because it wasn't just the small slice of staff who had the privilege of being able to step away from work for 2 full days, right? It was a much broader, it was visitor services, it was security, operations staff, all the hourly folks who aren't always able to participate in things like that. So I did see a bit of that in my museum.
Mia is going to be working with a de-escalation trainer that's rooted in like a social justice de-escalation training, and I'm not remembering the name of this group right now, but I'm going to look right now in my emails quickly. But let's see. But yeah, it's kind of just like pockets, but I would love to learn more if people have kind of a more solid plan. Hollaback is great. Yes, shout out Hollaback. Gosh, I can't remember. Hang on. One moment, please. They're called Whitebird Clinics. And I'll drop the chat here. I think they're based out of, let's see. They are based out of Eugene. They're based out of Oregon. But Hollaback also is incredible. I've attended some of their trainings and highly recommend them. Okay.
Thank you, Anissa, for the resources. And if anybody in the participants have other resources to leave in the chat, please feel free to do so.
We have about 2 more minutes. I want to give people space and time to share. And yeah, this thought, maybe a departing thought or a link connection to the manifest session later, but how far can anti-racist trainings go if people at the top are upholding white supremacy? So part of a bigger arc of organizing for sure. But yeah, wanting to say thank you, very much thank you to Rose and Nikhil for presenting. Thank you to Jackie for jumping in at the last minute. Thank you to Dr. Porchia Moore, who put in a lot of thought work but was not able to attend. Big shout out to Jasmine and to Sarah, our ASL interpreters. A deep, heartfelt thank you to everyone who participated in the chat, who was listening, who was taking it in, absorbing. We hope that you will join us for our next session, which is at, oh dear, 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. We're having a closing session talking about manifesting. And as a reminder, thank you to those who supported this work, and donations are here to help support our speakers and the museum workers relief fund.
Anissa, can I just share a quick thought in response to Andrea's question about how far we can go if the people at the top are upholding white supremacy? So like organizing is a way to build power against folks who aren't on the same page, really, right? And we don't need to wait for our leaders to be on board in order to press them to really not have any other choice but to make the right one. I feel like the movie Selma illustrated this in the context of the civil rights movement, where they showed the conversations between Dr. Martin Luther King and Lyndon B. Johnson, where he was saying that he couldn't really get the buy-in to pass legislation unless there was like the loud demands that the mass of people that Dr. King was organizing, giving legislators no choice, right? And I think there are ways that we can do that with the power that we have within our staff organizations to build power collectively to push our leadership to make choices, even if they're sort of in a place where their default mode might be to make choices that uphold systems of oppression that we're fighting. So I hear the struggle in your question, Andrea, but I do bring hope to these conversations that we as marginalized people broadly are people who know how to organize and know how to build power and can move mountains.
Yes, all power to all the people. We got this. Oh, this is so affirming. Thank you, everyone. Gosh, I want this to keep going forever. But it can. Shout out to Alyssa for dropping Museum Workers Speak. Mass Action is also organizing to, push power in different ways. There's an anti-racist community of practice that's ongoing, the accountability group. There are, again, we talked about connecting hyper-locally. We have groups that are in place. Inclusium, amazing resource. Let's continue to build this. Visitors of color, like we have to extend these conversations into the work that's already been done. So shout out to everyone who is doing this work ongoing, and to the new folks that are popping up as well. But collective liberation, we got this together. Shall we all unmute and say goodbye together?
Sure.
And also a waterfall in the chat. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you all so much.
Bye. Bye.
So good to see your faces.
Everybody.
Be well.
Likewise.
Take care of each other.
Yeah, me too.
Power to the people.
Power to the people.
All people, yeah.